3.5 V6 283 horsepower VQ35D, 4.5 V8 315 horsepower 328 horsepower VK45D. The first generation Infiniti FX had only two engines installed, both petrol V-shaped with 6 and 8 cylinders. Both engines are very reliable and unpretentious. However, many early Infiniti owners in the second half of the 2000s were faced with the overhaul of these engines or replacement with contract ones. The death of these engines was associated with the destruction of the converters. The situation is standard. Bad fuel leads to melting and destruction of the converters. Its dust gets into the cylinders, leading to scuffing. Oil burns, misfires, etc. All this indicates that the engine has become unwell. Perhaps today this problem has disappeared. Neutralizers have been cut out a long time ago. Nothing threatens the cylinders. But what has always threatened these V-shaped engines is overheating. A main radiator covered with a thick layer of dirt and dust, leakage of coolant through a burst expansion tank or through a cracked radiator, and a non-working main fan, all this inevitably leads to overheating of the engine. If the overheating is slight, then the plastic valve covers are deformed from the heat, causing an oil leak. Also, overheating is a direct path to the occurrence of piston rings, after which oil burns occur. But we will touch on this later. If overheating is severe, it leads to deformation of the cylinder head. As a result, the tightness between the lubrication and cooling circuits is broken, these liquids enter the cylinders, and corresponding exhaust smoke appears. Separately, we note that the V-shaped 6 has a problem with cooling the 5th and 6th cylinders. In this case, these are the cylinders farthest from the radiator. They receive liquid that is already thoroughly heated in the engine, so overheating originates there. Owners of Infiniti and Nissan 350Z around the world know this problem, but it can be eliminated by organizing the removal of heated antifreeze from the very rear of the block, from the area of the 5th and 6th cylinders. To do this, you can use either specially designed parts or Nissan components. Roughly speaking, you need to add a flange 110604P110 and place the rear tube 110605W900, as well as the associated seals and thermostat. There are about 10 parts in total. And the V6 engine in the FX will run with less heat load. The higher the mileage, the higher the oil appetite of both engines. If you change the oil every 10,000 kilometers, then between changes you will have to add 1 to 2 liters of oil. This is practically the norm for these engines. Perhaps today there are no first-generation Infiniti FX left that do not consume oil. Scuffing on the surface of the cylinders cannot be blamed for this. This is how wear on the engine as a whole manifests itself. If the engines of this crossover consume oil, then try to check its level regularly. Because often these engines, through an oversight, drink all the oil, which ends with the liners turning. V8 engine on restyled ones, i.e. since the 2006 model year, the Infiniti FX has been equipped with a time bomb. The engine has 4 dampers in the upper half of the intake manifold, each of which is secured with a pair of screws. Naturally, they unscrew and fly into the cylinders. The first failures of VK45D engines for this reason occurred at mileages of 90,000 kilometers. This problem is easier to prevent than to cure by removing the top of the intake manifold, removing each screw, and using thread sealant. It will take about 3 hours to do everything. And don't forget to change the intake gasket, 14035A000. To summarize, the VQ35D and VK45D engines are not capricious and are capable of running 500,000 kilometers with little oil consumption. All that kills them is one or another manifestation of inattentive and very economical maintenance. The chains of these motors last 200 to 250,000 kilometers. These engines do not have hydraulic compensators. Instead, they have calibrated pushers, 13,231 EY03C. However, checking and adjusting thermal clearances should only concern owners of FX crossovers that have LPG installed on their cars. Let us add that these engines can stall while driving. The culprit is always a failed crankshaft or camshaft sensor. Many Infiniti FX owners are surprised by the bursting of the main radiator. This part of the cooling system simply leaks as standard. But the problem is not the strength of the radiators, but how thick the layer of dirt is on them. And also in the cap of the expansion tank, the valve of which stops releasing excess pressure. Let's add here the radiator fittings. They are highly corroded under the influence of reagents, and then leak or even break off. Jatco JR507A/RE5RO5A 5-speed automatic transmission. The 5-speed automatic transmission from the Court company Jatco is very reliable, but the most aggressive and harsh drivers manage to render it unusable after 150,000 kilometers. In practice, the breakdown of this automatic transmission manifests itself not only in kicks and impacts, but also in the loss of reverse gear. If you simply operate this crossover adequately, The Jatco unit will run more than 300,000 kilometers. You need to change the oil every 60,000 kilometers. Monitor the condition of the hoses between the automatic transmission and the cooling radiator. It's better to connect a separate radiator to them, because there are unpleasant cases of antifreeze getting into the ATF cooling circuit. This occurs because a crack appears in the combined main radiator. The cleanliness of the main radiator also affects the health of the automatic transmission. This is another argument in favor of cleaning the entire sandwich of heat exchangers. Owners of these cars should be aware that water collects in the niche under the battery, on the left under the hood, due to clogged drains. When its level rises, it reaches the wiring. Water can reach the control units through the wiring harnesses. You will immediately know about this. Fault indicators will light up on the instrument panel, and many errors will appear in the memory. You will have to not only clean the drains, they are under the battery stand, but also dry all the wiring, right down to the connectors on the blocks. In most cases, after drying, the blocks continue to function normally. The Infiniti FX's brakes are weak in every sense. True, if the car is driven by a super calm driver, then he will not notice any special or regular problems. What is the problem? Brake discs are thin, so they easily overheat and become deformed both from their own heat and when water from puddles gets on them. It is useless to sharpen them, they will become even thinner, and even more tender. Replacing with the original does not really help. The most active and aggressive Infiniti FX drivers change discs literally at every oil service. What to do about it? The best solution is to install brake calipers from FX second generation, since 2008. There are also options with the installation of brake mechanisms from Porsche Cayenne or special tuning kits. Such measures also solve another problem, the insufficient efficiency of the original brakes. Single piston front calipers on pre-restyling FX and two piston front calipers on restyled ones are equally weak. Well, if the driver drives the Infiniti FX really calmly, then he should carry out maintenance on the brake calipers every few years. The guides corrode, which leads to uneven pressing of the pads or to jamming of the calipers. The Infiniti FX has selectable all-wheel drive. An electro-hydraulic clutch engages the front axle as needed. The entire transmission as a whole is very reliable. But inadequate annealing and drifting on dry asphalt can kill it and the front CV joints, even to the point of breaking the splines. Well, if water from under the battery reaches the all-wheel drive clutch control unit, 41650 CZ70A, then expect corresponding troubles with errors and all-wheel drive shutdown. During adequate operation, keep the gearboxes and couplings dry. The oil in all these components can and should be changed. About 2 liters of special oil, 999 MPa 100p, is poured into the front axle coupling. 3 liters of regular gear oil, 75W90, goes into both gearboxes. Cardan shafts and their crosspieces, in particular, last quite a long time. But again, it all depends on the adequacy of operation. The crosspieces are maintenance-free. If play appears in them, which often happens in the front, then they need to be changed as soon as possible, before the cardan springs are broken by the play. Matching crosspieces, gun 45, cost $8. Looking at the muffler, you can again think about corrosion. Its resistance to salts and reagents is average. Sometimes corrosion eats through it. There are also cases when, during acceleration and braking, something begins to knock and rumble in the very rear bank of the muffler. This happens because the internal partition breaks off. The Infiniti FX steering rack is considered weak and lasts an average of 90,000 kilometers before a knock appears. It is believed that you can make her life easier. You just shouldn't park or leave the car with the wheels turned all the way in the cold season. Moisture and dirt get under the rack boots, which lead to wear of the rack bushings and even corrosion. Well, in general, this rail, if not damaged by corrosion, is repairable. And if, when turning the steering wheel all the way, rustling and biting appears, then it's time to change the crosspiece, ST1540, of the steering shaft. The suspension of this crossover, as you might guess, is that of a passenger car. Its most terrible enemy is wheels of huge diameter, at least 18 inches. Moreover, sometimes owners install disc-through spacers, widening the track. The most expensive consumables of the chassis are wheel bearings. The original ones barely last 80,000 kilometers. The front 40,202 EJ70B sells for $220 and the rear 43,210 WL000 sells for $80. The front stabilizer struts, 54,617 CG000, last up to 50,000 kilometers, but the original ones are inexpensive, $20. The rest of the suspension is not very capricious and can travel 150,000 kilometers before replacing worn-out silent blocks. You can't buy original silent blocks for the front levers, 54,501 CG200, the assembled levers will cost $260 a piece. Ball joints are not available separately. At the rear, this crossover has an impressive multi-link. No original silent blocks are sold separately here, but some, for example silent blocks, 55,152 CA000, 55,157 CA000 and 55,148 CA000 in the trunnion, are suitable for Murano. The small lower links 551A1 CG010 and 55,110 CG000 costs $60. The most expensive lever is the upper one, 55,502 CG000, costs about $500. But there are cheap analogs and non-original silent blocks at reasonable prices. However, the ball joint for it is not sold separately. In case of major problems, you will need to replace the silent blocks of the rear subframe, including the hydraulic silent block at the mounting point of the rear gearbox. All of them can be selected according to unoriginal proposals. Corrosion resistance is good. But years, or rather the number of winters and the duration of exposure to salt and reagents on the body still have an effect. Perhaps the most painful part in terms of corrosion is the metal in the rear wheel arches. At first, the source of corrosion is not visible there, but then streaks of rust through the joints of the rear bumper and wings indicate it. The hood is aluminum, the trunk lid is plastic. They are immune to the usual red corrosion. If the car was poorly washed from winter dirt, then you should expect paint to swell along the wheel arch trims and along the moldings. The lower edges of all steel body panels are also at risk. Over the years of use, the headlights begin to sweat. Water after washing or rain gets inside through the dried adhesive sealant around the perimeter of the lampshade. This problem can be solved by unsticking the headlight and installing the glass with a new sealant. The Infiniti FX has a lot of problems with the door locks, which result in the doors not opening either from the outside or, less commonly, from the inside. It is useless to pull the external handles, you can break them off. The front door locks may hang due to spring fatigue in the mechanism for switching the open and closed positions. Water entering the mechanisms leads to corrosion of the actuator motors. Also, the cables to the locks from the door handles burst. In these cases, as a rule, it is necessary to remove the door trim from the inside with the door closed. It's difficult, but possible. This is the only way to get to the lock and cables. And if the driver's door lock begins to live its own life, i.e. opens overnight, locks and unlocks while driving, etc., then the so-called lock activator, 80,603 cm80A, needs to be replaced. The front panel on the first generation Infiniti FX begins to look creepy over time. Pimples resembling blisters appear on its upper surface. This is how its vinyl coating swells. Such a terrible cosmetic defect can be corrected only by replacing the entire panel, which is expensive and does not last long, or by reupholstering the panel. Ideally, use the best quality vinyl, rather than leather or leatherette, because it's not a fact that the navigator's airbag will be able to break through it in an accident. In general, the interior of the Infiniti FX gets worn out quite quickly and loses its premium look. The sides of the seats are cracking, they are made of artificial leather. The plastic around the automatic transmission selector and in front of the armrest is scratched. The front seat frame of the Infiniti FX is rather weak, it cannot support the weight of large drivers and brakes. In this case, lateral rocking and squeaking appear, and when the chair is raised using servo drives, it tilts to the side. In this case, the chair needs to be removed and inspected from below. In its rear part you will find cracks in the transverse tube and, possibly, in the front strut. All these cracks and broken cross-sections can be welded. Over time, the plastic gears on the worm shafts, which are responsible for the longitudinal movement of the chair, wear out. Usually one of the gears wears out, after which, when the position of the chair changes, it does not move along one of the sides and warps in the horizontal plane. Repair gears can be purchased, and access to them is from below the seat in its front part. This is where the longitudinal adjustment gearboxes are located. Over time, the Infiniti FX's interior fan begins to creak. The creaking occurs in the worn bushings of its shaft. A new original fan, 27,225 AM610, cost about $280. There are replacements for $70, $100. You can choose a fan from disassembly. The main thing is that the rotor does not play. There is a popular way to eliminate squeaking, which involves replacing bushings with bearings. If the fan just turns on every once in a while, then you need to replace the relay, 2,523,079,942, and the fuse box on the left in the passenger compartment. There are also cases of burnout of transistors on the control board of the fan electric motor, and it simply will not turn on. It will have to be replaced. A common problem with the Infiniti FX is the incorrect fuel level display. The pointer on the dashboard can be misleading in any direction. This is due to contamination or wear of the potentiometer tracks of the fuel level sensors. This car has two sensors, both in the tank. They are accessible from under the rear seat. There is one sensor installed on the left, 25,060 CG00E, and on the right there is a sensor together with a fuel pump, 17,040 CG00B, which also contains a fuel filter. It is necessary to clean and inspect the potentiometer tracks. It is advisable to immediately check them with a multimeter. The resistance should change smoothly. A new sensor and fuel pump cost $200, $250. There are no cheap replacements. The Infiniti FX's electrical system is generally reliable and does not suffer from systematic problems. Sometimes the engine ECU and the color central display control unit require soldering. Due to their malfunction, the engine does not start and the multimedia does not turn on. The Bose speaker system sometimes loses sound in the left channel. This can be corrected by manipulations in the loop in the head unit.